Всем привет, это проект Alpha.
Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. Alexey Arestovich is with us online. Good evening. Yes, hello. Let's start another day of our diary, war diary. And we're celebrating inauguration of Donald Trump today. Your impressions from it? Do we have to already note something from his speeches and everything? What do you think? Well, frankly, Nikolai, I have not noticed any special symbolisms or anything from which one can deduce a huge conspirology. No, but in the frame of said trend, I do like the trend. All right, so the trend has commenced. Now we'll start looking at what's going to happen. All right, yeah, there will be now, Nikolai, a carousel of events that we probably will not have enough time to react to them. And thank God. In my opinion, Nikolai, during the last 40 years, world politics were changed into something from which the flies are usually dying from boredom. This is not how it should be working. This usually is an indicator of civilizational stale. And it's nice when a president taking power says that we will step on Mars. That feels nice. All right, Alexey, yeah, this is a good framework. In the inner politics, Trump made a lot of announcements in regards to American domestic policies. He said about emergencies on the border in the south, send all the villains from Latin America back home, all the criminals. Right, Nikolai, he announced two emergencies, one in the energy sector, another is in fighting with illegal migration. This is a good message. If I all of a sudden found myself at the helm of Ukraine, I would have implemented four emergencies, actually. One is in economy, second is in energy systems, third is in demographic, and fourth in fighting corruption. Why? Because emergency by itself is needed to avoid the regular procedures, to expedite things. The simplest example that I can see here is Czech Republic, the way they purchased vaccines and implemented measures against COVID back in 2020. Czech Republic implemented an emergency to just avoid all the bureaucracy in regards to purchasing vaccines and other materials. And that was acknowledged in the open by the government, that they do not have time for all these procedures. So emergency is needed as an instrument. It is not for enjoying one's capabilities or for punishing all enemies and winning over all political opponents. No, of course not. It is needed to quickly resolve some procedures. Because if you compare Czech Republic and Ukraine, then our approval procedures are much heavier than what they have in Czech Republic. And yet it was them who instituted an emergency, not us. Ukraine needs saving. If one is to do the real audit of Ukraine, it will show that we do have an actual catastrophe. Everybody is aware about our demographic situation, that it is below the reproduction level. But I think we would also discover that in the other three sectors, in fight with corruption, in energy systems, and in economy, this is a complete and utter catastrophe. And these are immediate things lying on the surface. What it would allow to do, it would allow us to make decisions, for example, with that same coalition government. I would have created, if I was in power, the coalition government of national rescue, and people are poking me saying, Arestovich, you don't have a team, where are you going? Friends, you are my team. I will gather my team from the most active criticizers of my positions. I would have gathered the government from all the different parties and would have set these goals in front. And I would explain that we need emergency, declared emergency, so that these people would try to solve the glaring issues, create the points and milestones for growth, and continue going forward. I do not need power for myself. I need a saved and rescued Ukraine. I'm open to gathering a team from the vicious opposition to me, from those who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to discredit me. But I would consider adding them to the government because they represent different layers of our society. And that's where I would put a question: do we have time to go through the regular procedures for, let's say, changing the tax code? Or do we need tax code yesterday? So, as an emergency, we could have implemented a new tax code by presidential decree, and then let's gather together a year later and amend it to make it better. And the same thing with economy, with medicine, many other fields. I like these examples because it is easy to explain. I'm usually taking responsibility on my shoulders. That's how I explain. I would have done that, and I'm not bringing somebody else to be responsible for that. I'm suggesting that that's what I would say. And I understand that Trump is also declaring emergencies not to satisfy his own pride, but he institutes emergency in the areas where he indeed sees an emergency. And it's probably not the last one. He might institute a few more or announce a few more. And it's basically a situation when one acknowledges that existing mechanisms cannot cope with an existing situation, or perhaps even have driven situation to be emergent. And it needs to be fixed. All right, Alexey, Trump also mentioned that United States is one of the strongest military powers in the world. Not exactly so, Nikolai. He said that I will stop the wars and we will make American army stronger than it has ever been. That was, I think, exact formulation. Why? Because we need it, from his point of view, as the guarantor of ending existing wars and precluding new wars from happening. He just understands how it works. He was a president before. He has been in this position. Very few people understand, but the main function of the army is not waging war. Waging war is a secondary function, probably tertiary or fourth and fifth. The main function of army is to prevent wars. If the army is at war already, that means they've failed in preventing this war. The army needs to be seen so strong that the enemy looking at our country would not add any solution that needs military mechanism for its implementation. We as a country in Ukraine failed with this task. And the war started, and now army is conducting the secondary goal of conducting a successful warfare. And what he's saying that in his inaugural speech is that our military in the United States will be so strong that nobody else will even dare to attack us or our interests. Alexey, I paid attention to another thing. It's known now that he will be taking certain measures against illegal immigrants, both on the border and also return of some of those migrants, some of the criminals, back to Mexico and beyond. So, is it clear for you what is he going to be doing in regards to the army, as well as the Mexican border? Well, first of all, Nikolai, there is usually a program. There's a program for development of armed forces for 5 years, for 10 years. There is plan in America for 2030, 2035, 2040. Oh, that's formality, right? No, Nikolai. It's formality in Ukraine. In America, this is actually a plan. They do have industrial military complex that they're using, and they're planning how to use it, and they're betting on new technologies, most likely, because presence of Musk and Bezos and the signs that Trump is sending is, first of all, betting on the scientific advancement and technological advancement. And let me point one more thing here. America has lost this war with Russia. Not America as a country, but Biden's administration. And the West, global West, had lost this war to the global South. And Trump administration is ready to change it. They're very eager to change the current situation. I understand they audited the existing state of things, and they understood that the global South is strong, that China, by the way, dumped $650 billion about 10 years ago or so. America was second to this race and was catching up later. They are contesting at about the same level right now. Russia, meantime, used armed force on the border and is ready to use it further in one of the most uncomfortable ways when it is heavy infantry fighting. And this is the most difficult thing for the West, to take a citizen from any of the Western countries, put him in a dirty trench and make him fight gun to gun, face to face. So South discovered certain strengths in this process, and the West discovered certain weaknesses in itself. And I think Putin definitely started this war to see about the reaction of the West. So the West audited themselves and said that, okay, we are stronger in technology. That means we should have the strongest, the most technologically advanced army that will be covering other things that our enemies are trying by all the technological advancements that the West is to achieve. So we can await more AI, new troops, Space Force, additional high-tech weapons to be implemented that can parry threats of Russia and China. So, okay, his decision about removing all barriers in regards to drilling for oil. In your view, Alexey, how soon, how quickly do you think this will affect the prices of oil on the global market? And that's one of the arguments that is being used that may drop the gasoline prices and oil prices down to hurt Putin's Russia. I'm not a specialist in this matter, Nikolai, but I think it's probably a secondary or tertiary goal for United States. The main goal for them is to provide United States with cheaper energy and creating new opportunities for development. Very few people talk about that, but all these new technologies, they eat a lot of energy. They eat a ton of energy. We're used to, lifting the lid of the laptop and we have a live stream. And it eats electricity, right? And a big data center eats electricity in huge quantities. They actually have calculated on the West, and you could have traced it in the different publications, that already now United States is pretty tight on energy, on certain parameters. And if you're betting on AI, big data, blockchain, currencies, you'll be running out of energy. And energy is the core basis for all development. Ukrainians went through that when we were sitting without any power after Russian attacks. When there's no energy, there's no civilization. When there's no gasoline, there is no civilization. So Trump wants to make sure that this problem doesn't even exist for the United States, so that under any circumstances, whether it's war or not, crisis or not, alien invasion or not, America would always have enough fuel and enough electricity. And unlike Europe that went for green program and renewable energy, Americans are not falling for this. That's why they're still using a lot of standard hydrocarbons and oil and gas resources. Of course, they're using secondary as additional resources, the solar and wind, but the main emphasis is on the traditional energy sources and nuclear.
America is the country that has a lot of reserves that are not being utilized now, drilled. And Biden, before leaving the office, he forbade drilling on certain areas, using certain natural resources, referencing certain ecological concerns, and not even going into details why he did that. So Trump is already on the vector of trying to cancel that. Trump is a rather non-standard person, making unusual decisions, but all of them usually are backed by ironclad logic behind. I'm trying to highlight those for you, the logic for you. In his speech, there was a lot of phrases, all, always, that one can say are populist statements, right? What does modern political thought suggests is to never use never or always, and suggests to use in many cases, most likely, most probable. Trump is not going to pick through these words. He's 78 years old, he needs to get things done. And that's why he is out there saying, guys, that's how we will be doing it. And this is a very cold-blooded calculation with numbers in his hands, and that's what stands behind the vector, behind the decisions. Alexei, at the end of Biden's rule, at the last day, I think today, right, that was, in your view, do you think Ukrainians, Ukrainian people, Ukraine as a government, as a country, do we need to say any words of gratitude to Biden? I would say, Nikolai, some words of gratitude because $66 billion of direct military aid, 150 something billion dollars of budgetary support. Without that, we would not be already. But this is a very specific gratitude with a certain aftertaste. Because during the last 3 days, there was a lot of revelations related to how Biden's administration and some of its representatives treated Ukraine and what they were betting on. If we look at the direct statement about Ukraine not having to win, that United States never talked about recovering any Ukrainian territory. And you know my opinion for today, looking at the information that I have, what we can read in the open sources as well. Let's look at that book, War, that is very popular and is being quoted quite a bit. Its author wrote it to justify decisions made by Biden administration, but it turned out to be a classic situation when investigation ended up catching itself. And the author really wanted to argue with facts and the laws of cause and consequence, and that's how they ended up pointing the finger at themselves. My opinion is very simple. Ukraine was hired to create trouble for Russia. You can call it bear trap, second Afghanistan, whatever. My opinion that our leadership sold Ukraine to quarrel with Russia. And for that, they were promised to get a blanket with colored pictures on it. And they got it. The rest of population did not get anything but dead bodies, destroyed economy, destroyed housing. But even those blankets turned out to be laced with some disease. So they were actually, all the money that were given to Ukraine, they were very sticky for Ukrainian bureaucracy. And if you're a Martian or, I don't know, Australian Aborigine looking at this situation without any emotional attachment to it, it's difficult to express the whole spectrum of my emotions on this. That's why I'm trying to detach myself. But it's very bitter for me to feel that my people were used so in that situation. But one can ask a question, would we be used if we did not agree to that? Right? Of course not. So responsibility is on them, but the guilt is on us. There is guilt on Putin for the hot war. There is responsibility on us for falling into that funnel of war. And in relations to Washington and Ukraine, Washington has responsibility, but we bear the guilt for allowing ourselves to be used in this role. In my view, this is a catastrophe. Ukraine deviated from its core, from being a crossroad of different worlds. In the most primitive version of it is the bridge between Europe and Russia, not only economic, but also cultural and the bridge of meanings. And we don't have anything now to offer, neither to Europe or to Russia. And by the way, Europe can find agreement with Russia, and the United States can also find agreement with Russia. Trump administration already announced the conversation with Putin. And then they'll talk with Xi Jinping, they'll create new Yalta, or separately or all together, a new system. And it is not entirely clear where's the place of Ukraine, and I can guarantee that we will not be asked about it. We will be put in front of the fact that this is where you ought to be. We as a country that suffered so many casualties with destroyed economy and everything as the result of this war, we will not even have a decision at the table. So one can ask a question, why? Why did we not stop? Why did we not agree to a different role? Why did we agree to this specific role? Why did we not stop it in Istanbul, in other negotiations? And we can say that we agreed to this role when we decided to be anti-Russia. I wrote a post today where I said that from a psychological point of view, whatever you keep in focus, in your attention, that's what you serve. So if today Putin and Russia disappears, nothing will change in my destiny. But those guys who were dragging us to be anti-Russia will have huge changes in their life. I can live without Putin. They don't even go to take a shower without Putin. Treacherous Putin and Russia are to blame. And Ukraine's duty is to destroy Russia, as they say. Now, put yourself in place of Russia. Imagine it's not driven by Putin, maybe Navalny or Ivanov or anybody. But next to your borders, there is a country that voluntarily, publicly announced that it is your anti-project and wants and seeks your destruction. What options do you have? That's a good question, Alexey. Well, we've analyzed this many times. I think Russia, even looking at the Cannon's telegram, it's a project where every threat is felt exaggerated internally. This was talked about Moscow country, about that whatever country Russia or USSR was, with Moscow at its center. That's what the whole doctrine of Cold War was based on, about holding and sustaining USSR and its borders and its aspirations in a certain way. Now, who decided that Russia stopped being a rabid dog and decided to become, I don't know, a kind bear or whatever you pick for it? It's quite unclear who was advising that. But I do have a question in this regard, maybe even to you. You saw how these decisions were made by President Zelensky, who, before the invasion, who was telling everybody and was conducting rather provocative politics against Russia. I would call it teasing a mad dog, teasing a rabid dog. He was actually taking active steps, saying that Russia will not do anything, will not retaliate, they do not have the right to do that. But Ukraine was doing a lot of actions that were, to say the best, were not friendly towards Russia. We're not trying to justify what Russia is. Russia is what it is, and we knew what it was for many years. If you read Cannon's telegram from 30 years ago, you understand that. Why, at some point, President Zelensky decided that it, at some point, became a different state? Nikolai, he never was thinking in these categories. At a press conference, one can ask him a very interesting question. How many books did you read in your life? And how many books did you read on geopolitics? I bet you he will not have anything good to answer. This is not in his contour of thinking. I remember those times. I remember what he was saying. Russia will not dare. We were wiping and we will continue wiping on them because there is United States on our side. Maybe Russia will do something, undertake something on Donbass to scare us, and that's it. So, Alexey, it was the collection of conclusion of almost a regular Joe, right? Yeah, very, very regular citizen. Not even the brightest one, Nikolai. Well, yeah, exactly, that's what I'm talking about. Just an average Joe doesn't have to be too smart. Right, on the other hand, one can call it the collection of propagandist stamps that he was expressing himself with. So, Alexey, do you think Zelensky tried to consult with somebody, maybe to look into some deeper thought, somebody who had more expert knowledge, or those people were not even in his contour? Well, no, yeah, of course, Nikolai, he had people like that. There is a national security advisory. There is Institute of Security of Ukraine. There are intel communities. They all expressed their opinions to Zelensky, and it was very often far different from what he was stating out loud. But he made his own decision. He did everything, essentially, to provoke Putin to start this war. And then he was still thinking that this war will not happen. And that's how we found ourselves where we are. So that book about war by Robert Woodward, Alexey, that you are referring to, everything in his quotes, everything in his materials indicates that Biden's administration was holding Ukraine's hands from swinging full force, and I mean 2022. Biden personally was saying that Putin might use nuclear arms under certain conditions if certain red lines are to be crossed by Ukrainian armed forces. For me, it's obvious, Alexey, that these signals were somehow sent to the higher political leadership of Ukraine. But I was not there, so I'm curious, how did it look from the inside when you were there? Because in regards to Kherson, for example, even when there were signals from United States, nobody listened to those, and Ukrainian armed forces were chasing Russian troops when they were leaving Kherson. But there are many other instances when Ukraine did listen. And with all that, Reznikov in July is saying that it's still possible to conclude this war by the end of this year. President set a goal for us to take back all the territory to the borders of 91. So that was talked about back in 2022. Meanwhile, United States were openly stating that they would not allow Ukraine to do that. So how do we understand that? Well, look, Nikolai, the Western press is already leaking on this regard. They're starting to try to explain how did the West end up in this situation. Ukraine is also doing some soul searching. How did we end up where we are? And it seems like we do know everything, how the war started and what was the process. I want to say, people, I was there in the office at that time. I don't know how this war started. Having been a person who was in the top 20 who were either making decisions or affecting decisions being made, the immediate surroundings of Zelensky. Even there were contours where we're not allowed to join, and some decisions were made only with one or two people in the room. So let me walk through certain milestones that I know that you can use to trace causation. So when we take Kherson, when we fight for this, before taking it, there was a dilemma whether we send the whole group to liberate the right bank of the river or send them further deeper to Crimea, to the mouth of Crimea. We could have taken Melitopol, Tokmak, and Russia did not have much fortifications there. That's what Zaluzhny was insisting on. That decision was not made. My question is, why was it not taken? It could give us gigantic advantages. And the proof of that was that we still went to advance in this direction a year later when Russia had already prepared its positions. We've wasted a lot of resources on taking Kherson back. Russia had a lot of landmines, had very well-trained paratroopers detachments there that were resisting. Indeed, we were hitting them till the end. We were not letting them out. But it seems to me, I don't know where Woodward is taking his data, but I can probably allow, I'm not stating that that's what happened, but I can allow that he's masking with the statement that we were involved actively about operating around Kherson with the United States in discussions, that it is masking another push to not go into southern offensive elsewhere. That's one supposition I can make. Another moment, during the Kharkov operation and when we starting Kherson operation, Putin makes a decision to include 4 districts, including Kherson district, into the Russia proper. They add it to their constitution, they shake hands, and in Russia, it is disallowed to disconnect or expel any territories from the constitution. So it's under threat of treason. So Putin is putting himself in an interesting situation where he cannot give those territories back legally. And he's doing it while we are taking. So the West, I think, what's hiding behind it is that the West started to negotiate with Putin to not go into winter campaign. Meantime, he starts also the other 2 decisions to mobilize people, and they start attacking Ukraine's energy structure. At that time, Western allies are begging of Ukraine. Milley was on these positions. Austin was also on these positions, but Milley was the main proponent. They were trying to push us that on the peak of our success in Kharkov and Kherson, we should sit down and negotiate with Russia. And we did not agree to that. Yeah, there was information that Blinken was also insisting on that. Blinken was insisting on continuation of war. Remember his visit when he played a guitar in Kiev pub during his visit? I did mention that in my social post because he played a specific song that was one of the symbols of Cold War. That was basically rather a challenging critique towards Kremlin. That was the message of this song. And he played it personally, and we continue the war. I'm not saying that just Johnson's visit changed everything after Istanbul summit, so we did not agree. I cannot say that just Blinken with his visit changed the flow of war here, but I want to indicate that this event definitely has some symbolic connectivity. That was the fish that surfaced and showed us what was happening in the depths that we can look at to understand what's happening down there. And one way or the other, we are being forced, we agree to continue fighting the war beyond 2022. And also another fact was that there was a significant drop down in support of Ukraine with arms and ammo. Robert Woodward is stating the number of that it fell 3 times compared to the initial volumes. And Zaluzhny was seriously concerned about the drop in volumes of support. And that was a double ultimatum tactic used already back then, that Putin was offered peace treaty and ceasefire and Ukraine in exchange for not going into winter campaign. And at the meantime, Putin disagrees with that. And we still decide that we will continue with our summer counteroffensive, while the supply lines are cut threefold. When I saw the numbers before the offensive, the table, and I think I mentioned that before in one of the streams, I said that our request for successful counteroffensive operations was on that table, their promises, and what was really supplied. And it was interesting for me when I was looking at this table, I was suspecting that our leadership, our military political leadership, at that time I was still part of it, I was suspecting that we would ask something unreal. That we'll ask a lot. We'll ask for 3 aircraft carriers, maybe 164 Abrams and 800 F-16s. But surprisingly, the numbers I saw that we asked for were rather modest. We really asked just the bare minimum. It was at the bare level to fulfill our operation, our counteroffensive. Even having that, it would not guarantee us anything. It could just guarantee us to be more or less within the military calculations. But a month and a half before beginning of this counteroffensive, if we consider that it started on the 4th of June, it was somewhere the end of April, roughly. On the best parameter in this list, we got supplies, we got support only for 28%, so less than a third. Average level of fulfillment was 4, 5, 9, 12, 18%. Median was about 12.5%. So almost 10 times less was given to us than what was needed for successful implementation of this counteroffensive. Meanwhile, Russians really knew where we are going to attack. Another good question, how did they get a whiff of that? So they're digging in. We are attacking with 20 or 30 military detachments, and they had about 56 detachments. This is an impossible calculation. You cannot attack prepared defense with smaller numbers and achieve any success without aviation, without significant artillery overpower the enemy. And our criticizers try to criticize 33rd for their use of Leopards and 47th Brigade for their endeavors. Regardless, our troops broke through several dozen, sometimes even 50 kilometers of landmines, and they broke through the first line of tactical defense. They did impossible. In parallel, Prigozhin and Wagner on the east started the task of drawing our forces away from the south. They start attack Soledar and Bakhmut, and we in turn call it Fort Bakhmut. And it's very interesting for me. I want to have a commission institute after this war to understand who invented that. And Zaluzhny didn't get the third Army Corps that he was supposed to get for counteroffensive, and that corps gets completely burnt near Bakhmut. After the war, I'll give you numbers of our losses there in Fort Bakhmut, and you will be horrified. Basically, we burnt our forces that we really needed down south to at least get Tokmak there, and we burnt them near Bakhmut. Now, Tokmak in the south is a very significant railroad and automobile center. That would have been a very significant achievement. However, if we compare it to the actual goals of the operation, of taking Melitopol and getting to the mouth of Crimea, this is, of course, not enough. But even that would be fantastic. That did not happen. We lost our forces in the south, and we burnt whatever additional reserves we had near Bakhmut. And we lost Bakhmut at the end, as anyway. And Putin got a huge moral advantage as a result of this. We lose our moral advantage. Zaluzhny on the 1st of November comes out with an article that was published in The Economist, basically going in the conflict with President of Ukraine, blaming current situation on his decisions. And President comes out and says, no, everything still goes, and I disagree with Zaluzhny. But you can see that after this failure, that our drafting commission started to be much more aggressive. This is when all these videos start to surface about how they capture people on the streets, shove them in the buses. Before that, we did not need that. After this event, after this failure, we started dragging people by force to army. This was the actual cost of our failed counteroffensive, because before that, people were still rather eagerly going on their own volition when they were getting notes. And this is a combined trifecta of several reasons. Diminished supply of munitions and equipment, enforced counteroffensive under this lack of supply. That was basically an organized murder, an organized slaughter when we were not provided enough and we were sent into this operation. Yes, on one hand, I am thankful to Biden's administration because without them we would have nothing, but I have even more questions to his administration and to our administration. Why were we in the role of aborigines fighting for some colorful blankets in exchange for our lives? And we could have paused in Istanbul. We could have paused after Kharkov and after Kherson. We did not have to go into that counteroffensive. There are many milestones and conditions where we could pause. And yet every time the decision was made to follow up with stupidity after stupidity. And now we're in culmination of this. We will be pacified by force on the conditions and terms that we probably will not like. So, Alexey, you're telling we will not be asked, or they perhaps will not ask us. I want to read another piece of news as a response to this. Lex Friedman, who had a podcast with President Zelensky, had another podcast today where he noted for himself that Zelensky did not use the opportunity to demonstrate a desire to conduct any negotiations, and he behaved counterproductively to the goal of peace treaty. And that was his estimation that he created a platform for Zelensky and Russia to continue negotiations and to get to some peace accords, because he's planning to go and record another podcast with Putin. Despite all the risks, he understands them, but still, he doesn't seem to care. So he estimates that the behavior of Zelensky is counterproductive. So that understanding of counterproductivity of Zelensky, is that common understanding in Trump's administration, his inner circle, or do they have different opinions on that? No, there's not much diversity. Let me be more accurate. I am not aware if these any discrepancies or divergent opinions exist in Trump's administration. I'm aware of a rather joint opinion that Ukraine is not supporting peace effort, that by the way, Trump's son published a tweet today that Zelensky was asking 3 times to be invited to inauguration process, and when we did not let him, he now is making statements that he didn't really want to. And you can imagine how it probably started, right? His family is sitting at the dinner table and probably discussing things, and Trump mentions something, and his son takes the phone and writes that tweet. Well, Alexey, do you think he can write a tweet or something that will break the peace effort? No, the son is not breaking the peace effort. He's just indicating whom they have to deal with. Can you please bring it back on the screen? He wrote, the funniest part is that he asked for an invite like 3 times unofficially, and each time got turned down. Now he's acting like he decided not to go himself. What a weirdo. So, the tragedy of Zelensky is, as a figure is that he rose to power on the political satire, and today he is an object of political satire from the administration of his leading ally that will be make an effort, a serious program to pacify Ukraine with its enemy. So the relation is very negative to all that story right now within the administration. And this is just the beginning, because there will be an audit of all aid that was given to Ukraine by United States. And their point of view, they're saying, was discussed internally, what is not being known at large to public. They're saying that in some directions, Ukraine managed to steal up to 40% of American aid. Listen to that, up to 40%. That part of weapons were sold to Africa. That there were some agreements with Russian Federation that Ukraine left some equipment for money, and Russians were coming in and taking it. How is that possible, Alexey? Well, that's what they're stating. And if they're stating that in private conversations, I think they probably have information that they rely upon, and they will make it public knowledge in the nearest future. If they will not make it public, then it will be just the words of Alexey Arestovich, who discussed that point on the 20th of January in a stream with Nikolai. But they're insisting that they will publish more details, and there definitely will be an audit. That's why it's not only the Western press that is crumbling now, and you know that Zuckerberg coming out, Zuckerberg with his Facebook saying that Biden administration was pressing on me, and more people coming out about vaccinations and pressure from the admin. So there'll be that crumbling about Ukraine too, and there'll be more thing coming out. And we as Ukrainians should be prepared to see colossal, disheartening news. And I don't know the exact speed or the exact sequence of them, but you'll probably come to realize that people with great reputation that you think are perfect, you'll probably find yourself in a very difficult situation when you'll be presented with the facts, how corrupt they are. And the main difference between you guys and myself is that I knew that a year and a half ago, and that's why I was rather harsh in my streams. Not because I'm so smart. I know a lot more now that I can afford myself to state. One simple reason: I don't have the materials to support certain statements. I know that that's how it was done, but I do not have a material database to support it. That's why I'm not discussing that. But Americans will dig up quite a lot of material, so be ready. Now, do you think Zelensky will react in certain fashion to the ultimatum? Look, the contacts with Putin's administration are rather intense between the United States. Now that Trump is an official president of the United States, before that his representatives could talk to Putin admin, but now he can do it himself. And Trump's vector is to enforce ceasefire in the shortest term, as fast as possible. And as we know from diplomats of different countries, Putin is ready to say yes, generally. There is some nuance, but overall he is ready to say yes, to go for a ceasefire in the nearest future, weeks, maybe a month. So generally, one can say 100 days, right, that were surfaced in one of the publications by the special representatives of Trump envoy to Ukraine. Then the discussion should go about the architecture. How do we do that? Putin can only conclude a ceasefire with Zelensky administration. Any contours of further agreement, full peace treaty, next 20 years peace treaty, cannot be written with administration that is considered to be illegitimate. And one has to be honest, because Putin's administration are saying that they will discuss that with Zelensky if he wins on the next elections in Ukraine. But we cannot talk to him now while he is overstayed president. So it looks like there'll be two-step solution before serious negotiations will happen. It has to be a ceasefire and then elections. And that new reality needs to occur before the summer, before the middle of the summer. Diplomats of some other countries are saying that Zelensky is aware of that plan and is going to resist this plan as much as he can. And they're getting two reasons. They're giving two reasons. He thinks that agreement without Ukraine, the peace agreement between Russia and the United States, is unfair. Here we can support his understanding and ask, how did it happen that with you, you had your power for 6 years, and as a result, they're talking about the peace treaty without Ukraine. 1 second here, Alexey, let me interrupt you. I think a more logical question is due here. How is it happening that in the moment when he's aware what the offer will be, that's probably already on the table, because world politics is rather obvious for you in the status that you have, like Trump and Zelensky, you get some preliminary work done, so you would not get a no, right? So maybe Zelensky is not aware that this tradition exists, that you are given by different channels the outline of the contour of the new agreement. Nobody wants to be trading with you over there. Everybody wants to be prepared to finally get to the point where it will be a yes from you. And this is a time when you need to be behaving productively, but rather instead, he's not. So maybe that's an important question. Do you think that's what's happening? Well, that's the second question then. First question is still, how come we spilled so much blood and they're deciding without us? Who was in charge, right? Well, and we are behaving counterproductively at the moment. Right, Nikolai. And who was in charge for 6 years? Who led us to this point? And second is, when reality is already happening, you know that this position you may not like, but you need to participate and you need to somehow create a productive flow, because everybody understands, and he understands that if you disagree, you'll be broken. You'll be broken and forced to agree. So third question, I guess, here would be, Nikolai, what other concessions, what other sacrifices are you going to put on the altar of your failing reputation? For me, a leader is the person who thinks about his people. The first criteria is, do we have more people as the result of your governance? Do we have more or less? And there are no excuses. Don't start the war. Don't make sure you do everything to prevent this war if you lost people during it, if you're about to lose people. Do people live better now than they did 5 years ago? The answer is also no. And what diplomats from several countries are saying, that he likely will be still very active in the elections, Zelensky is, and he will be announcing new sanctions against his political opponents. And he very likely will go for some very critical decisions about announcing some people to be traitors, etc. And there'll be probably more provocations internally. That's where Western allies are expecting a lot of activity from Ukraine in some fashion under Zelensky administration, perhaps some attacks on Kremlin, perhaps attacking another district in Russia, maybe attacks of different energy sources in Russia, and factories. So a question here to be asked would be, how do you work with a person who behaves like this? Because the West usually models different things, right? They scientifically create models, double-check, triple-check them, look for different options, and that's what they look at. And that's what they're expecting, that's what their modeling is suggesting will happen. No emotions, very rational, they just calculated the probabilities, and they're seeing that these are significant risks with Zelensky. Now, you also have an agreement between Trump and Putin about ceasefire. There is Xi Jinping also, who wants to share a certain part of the world and continuous negotiations and headbutting on the periphery, because likely one treaty will not solve it all. And we have very unconstructive position of Ukrainian administration in regards to one of the key elements for Trump's plan. So how will Trump and his administration behave? Let's model that, right? We can do it right here. So investigation and audit is the very least that we are to expect in Ukraine. Right, Alexey? I think that's obvious. So, friends, get ready to serious ground-shaking announcements, and those people whom you thought are fantastic and very deity-like figures in administration, perhaps you'll discover that they're not so. All right, Alexey, we also analyzed the signals of Biletsky to Moiseechuk in his interview, who said that ceasefire is not bad, this opportunity for us to fortify, to get better. This also dispels the argument about radicals who perhaps will not sit down and negotiate. Kirill Veres, combat battalion commander, who is very well known in Ukraine, right? He also mentioned in a podcast of the 3rd Storm Brigade, and verbatim he said that I am for ceasefire and for freezing this conflict, because any war ends with negotiations or capitulation or whatever, but terms are important. I do not agree to bend over backwards and get on my fours. I am for saving lives of people and freezing the front line. Tell me the conditions and I'll give you my opinion on this. And this is a very understandable human position of an active serviceman, a battalion commander, a person who has a lot of fame, so he can afford himself to make this statement publicly. And he doesn't care about the mainstream opinion because he has his own support. I've seen also Mr. Biletsky recently made a statement that Arestovich is expressing an opinion that people do like. Now people do like peace, and that's why Arestovich is now talking about peace. Well, this is, as I was listening to that, I was smiling, because if you listen to our streams from a year ago, de facto you were going against mainstream, when mainstream was absolutely different from that opinion, and you were the first one to actually break off and go in this direction. So, and mainstream for the main part is still not changed. It may be divided now, but I think there are a lot of people, including President's administration, that wants to continue pressing with the war. Dykyi, also another person who is well known, is of that opinion, who is stating that Ukraine does not need to finish war in 25, perhaps in 26. Meanwhile, people on the front, those extremists that Zelensky is afraid of, they're saying that no, ceasefire is good. We need to discuss and we need to stop this bloodshed. Meanwhile, people closer to political circles of Ukraine are expressing a different opinion. They are on the bandwagon that Ukraine needs to continue fighting and that ceasefire needs to be pushed further out. So, in my opinion, the position of battalion commanders like Veres is a position that you expressed, very similar to a position that you expressed many times, and only now that becomes somewhat voiced in our society. So I think the question is, of course, to preserve the army, 100%. This is our interest, this is interest of Ukraine, that's obvious. But continuing the war is not an obvious interest, right? We do not quite understand how, with what resources are we going to do that. And perhaps it's a good time with Trump to still have that switch and change the opinion in Ukraine. Right, so you just brought 4 different people, Biletsky, Veres, Chmut, and Dykyi. And 2 of them are practitioners, they're fighting on the front. 2 of them are not brigade commanders, they're more from the political circles, or thinking about supplies and economic cost, etc. I'm removing myself from this equation, and this is a situative repetition of what happened before in Ukraine. You can look at Bandera, who was a fighter against everything. He was sitting in the concentration camp in Germany. In 1942, there was a Ukrainian rebellion army created. Bandera was the head of a different organization, but rebellion army was organized as the right organization. Meanwhile, in 43, just a year later, they already appealed to creating international detachments, Georgian, Armenian, Russian. So in the Ukrainian Liberation Army, there actually is international contingent fighting against Soviet Union and against Hitler. So they were appealing to fight against 2 evil forces. In 2 years, they drifted from the right spectrum to the left spectrum. Why? Because they were practitioners. They do understand, and they were reporting
in Donbass and other regions that our social ideas are accepted by people with delight, our national ideas are not accepted. So they were changing it. And who was doing it? Shukhevich. People like Cook, guys like them who are associated with extreme right. They actually drifted to the left because practice confirmed to them that life is more complex than what it seems like. And if they're practitioners, they actually follow life. They follow what is happening. And people were joining that liberation army while they were not the extreme right position. When Bandera learned about the existence of liberation army, he was very surprised. And that army was fighting for 2 years. In 42, 43, 44, he doesn't know that it exists. He doesn't know about their program. And here's the difference for you between theoreticians and practitioners. End of the first hour. Thank you guys. If you enjoyed, do not forget to click like and subscribe. I really appreciate that. It's the word of mouth that helps our channel to grow and allows us to continue translating these materials. Presenting somewhat different point of view on the events happening in Ukraine, arguably having a bit more logic and strategic thinking behind it than the current leadership of the country does. And if you really like what we do, you can click that super thanks button. Thank you. Privateer out.